Did you also have access to the Sperian GPS location information for the Prius rental car?
Yes, we did.
And based on the GPS for the Prius, where does the Prius appear to be during the same time frame we've been discussing?
We do have a location for the Prius at 10:25 p.m. here on the evening of the 15th, and it would appear to be in the parking lot of Ms. Magbanwa's residence.
I want to now turn to July 16th of 2014. What do Mr. Garcia's phone records and Mr. Rivera's phone records tell us about the movements of their handsets?
Well, looking at both handsets, Mr. Garcia's being in orange and Mr. Rivera's being in blue, we again see the use of cell sites in a kind of a chronological order here that will be consistent with travel leaving Miami.
And that begins at what time on the 16th?
It begins a little just after noon.
Did you also have access to the SunPass toll records or transponder records in this case?
Yes.
And did you gather any information from the SunPass toll records?
Yes, there was a westbound toll transaction at 2:18 p.m. And again, looking at the cell sites in use and the times, that would be consistent with traveling through the toll plaza at that time.
Can you show an overview of the remaining direction of travel after passing through that SunPass toll booth?
Yes.
Okay, walk us through that, please.
So again, travel continues west as we saw previously, north along the 75 corridor and into Tallahassee.
For this trip beginning in Miami and heading to Tallahassee, do we have any additional GPS information for the Prius rental car?
Yes, we have another location at 11:26 p.m. And again, looking at the cell sites and the time of the GPS location, they would appear consistent.
You kind of trailed off. I mean, 11:26 p.m. What?
Yes, sir. The rental location was at 11:26 p.m. the evening of the 16th. And comparing that to the cell site locations and times, that GPS location will be consistent with the travel of the handsets.
And what highway or interstate is that GPS ping located on?
The GPS ping is located on I-10.
Can you tell from the records what time these two handsets arrive in Tallahassee?
Just after midnight, the morning of the 17th.
Is there any particular location that the handsets appear to be consistent with upon their arrival in Tallahassee around 1 a.m. on July 17th?
Again, as before, Mr. Rivera's handset is communicating with the cell site that will be consistent with servicing the area of the budget inn.
Did law enforcement in this case gather any evidence from the budget inn?
We did, yes.
And what was that?
That was an actual registration for a hotel room.
Now that budget inn location that the handsets are consistent with upon arrival in Tallahassee, is that the same budget inn we discussed from Mr. Rivera's phone records in June 2014?
Yes, it is.
So now let's talk about July 17th, 2014. What day was this in relation to Mr. Markel's murder?
The day before.
And do either Garcia or Rivera have any events the morning of July 17th, 2014?
Yes, Mr. Rivera's handset has more events, and the events in that morning are again consistent with the budget inn.
Are there any time periods on July 17th, 2014 that either Mr. Garcia or Mr. Rivera's, God bless you, handsets are consistent with the Dan Markel's residence on Trescott Drive?
Yes, again, looking at the cell site and sector that would service the area of his residence, we see that Mr. Rivera has events at 11:47, 11:58 time frame, and then again a couple of hours later.
Does Mr. Garcia have any events consistent with Trescott Drive?
Yes, and in this time frame, we see Mr. Rivera's events 2:30, 2:45. Mr. Garcia has an event at 2:30. Again, communicating with a cell site and sector, not the same one as their different carriers, but both of those cell sites are located pretty close together there.
Do you know where the handsets appear to go later on that evening, the evening of July 17th, 2014?
Well, we see a number of events that would be consistent with North Monroe Street here in Tallahassee.
Did you just say North Monroe Street, Tallahassee?
I did.
Any specific motel or hotel?
Yes, we also had a ledger from the Roadway Inn that provided some information on where they may have been staying that evening.
Are you familiar with Luis Rivera's statement that while he and Mr. Garcia were on Trescott on July 17th, 2014, that Mr. Garcia had pointed out a woman to him that he claimed was Wendy Adelson?
I am familiar with that, yes.
Okay. Did you review Wendy Adelson's phone records and the location information for her events to determine if it's possible her phone was at that location at that time?
I did, yes.
And is it possible?
Possible. I would say unlikely, but possible. She is returning from the area of her work and traveling to her home, and she does travel that way. The timing would be awfully tight.
Are there any records of communications between Catherine Magbanwa's handset and Sigfredo Garcia's handset the day before the murder, this day on July 17th, 2014?
Yes, there are.
And now I want to move to July 18th of 2014. This is the murder day,
Yes.
right? Where do Mr. Garcia and Mr. Rivera's handsets appear to be the morning of July 18?
Mr. Garcia's handset doesn't have locations until a little later on in the morning, but Mr. Rivera's first events are again consistent with the Roadway Inn.
Then, do we have any other evidence of the location of the Prius on that morning?
We do. From the surveillance video, we see the approximate arrival time of the Prius to Premier Health and Fitness at around 9:16 a.m. that morning.
And these are from the videos from Premier Gem that were introduced in evidence in this case?
That's correct.
So on this slide, what are you demonstrating?
Again, just the arrival time of the Prius to the area of Premier Health and Fitness.
At 9:16 a.m., is that correct?
Yes.
Are Mr. Garcia and Mr. Rivera's handsets consistent with the tower which services the Premier Gym on the 18th of July, 2014?
Yes, and again, this is the same information that we received initially from the tower dump and looked at, and those handsets are communicating with the cell sites and sectors that will be consistent with Premier at around the time the Prius rental is there.
Any information about what time the Prius may have left Premier Gym?
Again, from the video, we can see the time that Mr. Markel departs, 10:38 a.m. The Prius departs immediately after, again, 10:38 a.m.
Are you aware of bus video surveillance in this case?
I am, yes.
Okay, so after and to your knowledge, did that bus video, surveillance video, come before or after this 10:38 departure from Premier Gym on July 18th?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this as being repetitive. Sergeant Corbitt has testified at length with regards to this evidence. During his first time up, the government is just reiterating the same information over and over again.
Let's not go over things we've already gone over, Ms. Norris.
Yes, sir.
Honestly, can't remember for sure everything that has been gone over, but some of this has certainly been covered.
Yes, sir. What is the last event for Sigfredo Garcia that we have with location information on July 18th after this 10:30 a.m. photograph?
I'm sorry, the last event? So we have events here 9:36 and 9:58. We don't have location information again until just after 12:30, and it's sporadic throughout the evening into the evening hours of the 18th.
That's my question. The last events we have are around between 9 and 10 a.m. When is the next event that we have for Sigfredo Garcia?
The next event that we have, and we look in the phone records, we see is we have a couple of incoming, outgoing notifications here, and then an outgoing call to Ms. Magbanua.
And that is the first call from that handset.
Yes,
Did that call connect?
it did.
And is there any indication it went to voicemail?
There's no indication it went to voicemail. In looking at Ms. Magbanua's records, there's no indication there that the call was routed to voicemail. Relatively short duration, but no indicators of voicemail.
And do the phone records indicate anything about the status of the phone from that last event to the 12:30 call to Ms. Magbanua?
We see two events that come in just after 12 that T-Mobile tells us were call forwarded. Those were routed to voicemail. They were not answered. They do not have location information. So it would be consistent with a number of scenarios, but ultimately the handset was unreachable, appeared to be unreachable in that time frame.
Could that be because it was powered down?
It could be, yes.
Objection, calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Where was the location of that 12:30 call to, where was the location of Mr. Garcia's handset at the time of that 12:30 call to Ms. Magbanua?
The 12:30 call occurs, we consistent with travel in the Alachua County area.
Can you zoom in? Okay. Did you compare the number of communication events for these two handsets going from Miami to Tallahassee compared to going Tallahassee down to Miami?
Yes.
And was there a difference between the frequency of communication?
There was, and while I did not look at the exact numbers of communication, it was relatively easy to see, just in looking at the number of cell sites, that there were fewer communications on the return trip than there were on the trip up.
Did you have any additional toll information to show us where on the trip back to Miami the toll records were?
Yes, again, there was a toll transaction at 5:23 p.m., eastbound in this case, and looking at the cell sites utilized, even though there are not as many, would still be consistent with passing through the toll plaza at about that time.
Was there any evidence in this case of what, any activities of Mr. Garcia or Mr. Rivera upon return to Miami?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time I'd offer into evidence what I've marked for identification as State's Exhibit 144. These are the bank records for Mr. Luis Rivera with a certified business record certification of authenticity.
Any objection?
No objection.
No objection. To be admitted.
Permission to publish excerpts, Your Honor?
You may.
Can you show us the excerpts from Mr. Rivera's banking records, which shed insight into his activities upon arrival back in Miami on July 18th?
Yes, there were a number of transactions, the one in particular that, or two in particular, one primarily that was of interest was an ATM withdrawal with the Pines Boulevard, Pembroke Pines address. And again, that was a location that we would want to compare with the phone records to see if it was consistent.
And can you go to the next slide?
Yes,
These are also contained in the CD of Mr. Rivera's bank records, is that right?
yes,
The highlighted ATM withdrawal, is that the one at Pembroke Pines in Miami?
it is, yes. The one document gives us the address of the transaction, and this one gives us the time so that we have something to compare with the phone records.
Is there, based on the bank records, a debit card use at a Big Daddy's on that date?
Yes, there is.
At what time?
9:15 p.m.
Based on the information from the bank records, were you able to determine, I mean, obviously you said the address, could you put that address on a map to see where the handsets were in relation to that particular ATM machine?
Yes. Again, comparing any known locations and times that we have with the phone records, we can see that the Chase ATM is located here, will be consistent with the path of travel for the handsets. And if we look in more detail, at the sectors being utilized, again, will be consistent with the handsets being at or near the bank.
And not to rehash, but is this the ATM from which we received the following 3 photographs that are already in evidence?
It is, yes.
If you could just click through those quickly. What do the handsets tell us about their location after this ATM transaction?
In essence, after the ATM transactions, they returned to the area around Mr. Rivera's residence.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Matt?
I'm showing you what I've marked for identification as States Exhibit 95. Do you recognize that map?
I do, yes.
And does that map accurately summarize the handsets movements from Miami to Tallahassee in July 2014 on the dates we've been discussing?
It does, yes.
I'm also showing you States Exhibit 96 for identification. Do you recognize that map?
I do, yes.
And does that map accurately summarize the communications for these 2 handsets going from Tallahassee back to Miami on July 2014?
It does.
All right, this time I'd offer an evidence States Exhibits 95 and 96 pursuant to our notice and summary.
Is there objection?
No, Judge.
95 and 96 will be admitted.
Now I want to expand our testimony. You were talking about mostly Mr. Garcia, Mr. Rivera, and sometimes Ms. Magbanwa's handsets. Did you also look at activity amongst other people in this case?
We did, yes.
Okay. And did you look at that particular activity the night before the murder, through the murder, to the day after?
Yes.
I got 1 moment. Before we go into that, is there ever a time that Catherine Magbanwa's handset calls the number 305-934-6615 in July of 2014?
Yes, there is.
And on what date does she call that 305 number?
I believe it's the evening of the 17th.
So the night before the murder.
That's correct.
Is there any other time that Catherine Magbanwa's handset calls that particular phone number, 305-934-6615?
In June of 2014.
And do you recall exactly on what date?
I believe June 4th. I can actually pull that up if I need to be specific on times.
You believe it's June 4th?
I believe.
Okay. Does this slide up here show us from the call records themselves the communications amongst the parties of interest?
It does, yes.
And this is from July 18th at approximately 12:01 a.m. until July 18th at 12:30 p.m.?
That's correct.
And can you remind the jury, I think you previously testified about this, but from this 12 a.m. to 12:23, 12 a.m. time period, I didn't say that right, 12:01, 12:07 time period, where Rivera and Garcia's handsets are located?
In this time frame, they would have been consistent with the roadway inn, the motel on North Monroe Street.
And that's the motel they stayed at the second night?
That's correct.
Okay. So at 12:01, can you just walk me through the communications here?
Yes, I can. 12:01, we see a call from Ms. Magbanwa to Mr. Garcia, 1 minute and 12 seconds. Mr. Adelson calls Ms. Magbanwa at 12:07 a.m., 3 minutes and 42 seconds. And there's another call from Ms. Magbanwa to Mr. Adelson, 12:34. 1:02 a.m., there's an attempted call from Charlie Adelson to his mother, Donald Adelson. No duration for that call. 1:03, he calls Ms. Magbanwa for over 20 minutes.
And that's the conclusion of the calls for the evening of the 18th, even though it's technically, The evening of the 17th is technically the morning hours, but.
Yes, we began after midnight the morning of the 18th.
Okay. So what is the next call we have at 8:09 a.m.?
Would be Wendy Adelson calling her mother, Donna Adelson.
And then go on, please.
There's at 9:12, Charlie Adelson calls Wendy Adelson. At 9:19, Wendy Adelson calls Charlie Adelson. It's an 18-minute phone call. 9:38, Charlie Adelson calls Donna Adelson, 30-second duration.
Let me interrupt you briefly. Between the 9:19 a.m. call from Wendy Adelson, to Charles Adelson, that's approximately 18 minutes, to the time at 9:38 a.m. that Charlie Adelson contacts Donna Adelson, where's the location of Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera's handsets?
In this time frame, they would be consistent with the Premier Health and Fitness Center.
Okay. So going back to the 9:38.
9:38 is a call from Charlie Adelson to Donna Adelson. 9:57, Charlie Adelson to Ms. Bagbanawa. 9:58, Ms. Bagbanawa to Mr. Adelson. And again, another return call from Mr. Adelson to Ms. Bagbanawa, a little over 7 minutes. 10:06, sorry.
No, you're okay. That's the last one.
10:06 a.m., Charlie Adelson again calls Wendy Adelson.
And then the last three calls at 10:07, 10:08, and 10:09 are between Bagbanawa and Charlie Adelson's handsets.
That's correct.
And what does the red line up here represent?
That would be the time frame in which Mr. Markel was shot.
Then the following communications are at 11:06 and 11:02, calls between Donna Adelson and Charlie Adelson.
Yes.
Is that followed by communications between Mr. Adelson and Catherine Bagbanawa?
Yes.
And the last one is the communication from, is that the 12:30 call from Mr. Garcia to Catherine Bagbanawa on the way down to Miami?
Yes, it is.
Miami. Okay. Going back to July 18th, can you tell us what Sigfredo Garcia, Catherine Bagbanawa, and Luis Rivera's handsets are doing that evening? This is after the ATM video we just
Yes, I would.
looked at.
I would like to clarify, and I apologize, it was not part of my presentation. The phone calls that you asked about to the 305-6615 phone number, those actually, the previous one was June 5th, not June 4th. That was at 10:59 p.m. on June 5th. And then there were two attempts on July 17th of 2014 at 11:40 and 11:41 from Ms. Bagbanawa to the 305 number that you mentioned.
And when you said, I couldn't quite hear you, on the July 17th, there were two calls at 11:40 and 11:41. Is that AM or PM?
That was PM.
Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, I want to go back to where we left off with the ATM and the banking transactions for Mr. Rivera. Where do Mr. Rivera and Mr. Garcia's handsets appear to go after that ATM transaction?
Again, they would appear to be consistent with the area around Mr. Rivera's residence.
Does Ms. Bagbanawa have any communication events around that time?
She does.
What you're showing here are these the events that we have from 7:10 p.m. to 8:40 p.m.?
Yes, again, looking in the records for activity or activity with locations, we see that there are phone calls here beginning at 7:10 and a few running through about 8:40 p.m. This would be the evening of July 18th of 2014.
Can you show us the location information for those particular events from 7:10 to 8:40?
Yes, and again, for all of those events, she would be consistent with communicating with the cell site that would be near her residence.
What is her next series of events after the 8:40 p.m. event?
So we see events at 9:20, 9:22, and 9:42. And again, those are calls between Ms. Bagbanawa and Mr. Garcia. The 9:20 and 9:22, and then the 9:42 would be Ms. Bagbanawa to Mr. Adelson.
Do you similarly have maps showing the location for the events from, 9:20 to 9:42?
Yes, and what we see here is now the handset for those first two events which one starts at 9:20, they're at 9:22, ends at 9:23, are all on the cell site here, which would be indicate some movement away from the area of her residence. And then the 9:42 event would be consistent with a cell site closer to Mr. Rivera's residence.
And I see you have McBanoa handset location in the red for the 9:42 event. You mentioned that was consistent with the Rivera residence. Are the other events for Mr. Garcia and Mr. Rivera at that same time frame also consistent with the tower servicing Luis Rivera's home?
Yes, they are. We looked at the kind of final event here between Ms. Bagbanoa and Mr. Garcia's at 9:46 p.m. The last attempted communication between them that evening. For that 9:46 event, and looking more particularly at the cell site and sector utilized, we would say that it would be consistent, again, with the area around Mr. Rivera's residence. And looking at their locations, represented in the blue and the orange, also communicating with cell sites and sectors that will be consistent with that general area.
So at the time, would you say that the cell sites Ms. Magbanoa's handset is using are consistent with the locations of the cell sites that Mr. Garcia is using?
They would be, yes.
And once they become being consistent, that's when communication between them ceases?
That's correct.
Does Ms. Magbanoa's handset have any more events with location information while she's in the area of Rivera's residence?
Well, we have two more events that evening with location information, a 10:12 phone call and a 10:20 phone call, one being incoming for Mr. Adelson and one outgoing to him. For those two events, her handset is still communicating with the same cell site and sector we saw for that 9:46 event.
And those are both communications between Magbanoa and Charles Adelson?
That's correct.
What other information do we have about communications or attempted communications between Catherine Magbanoa and Sigfredo Garcia after that 10:20 event between Magbanoa and Mr. Adelson?
Well, after the 10:20 event, the next thing that we see in her records would be incoming attempts from Mr. Garcia to reach Ms. Magbanoa, and all of those calls indicate they were routed to voicemail. Those are at 3:08, 3:11, and 3:26 a.m.
Okay. So, since Mr. Garcia's handset's attempting to contact Ms. Magbanoa, can we tell where the handset is at those times? 3:08 a.m., 3:11 a.m., and 3:26 a.m.?
I'm sorry, which handset?
What?
Which handset?
Ms. Magbanoa's handset.
We cannot. With that, her phone not being in communication with the network, these calls are not creating location events for us, so we have no way of determining where that handset could be.
What are the last events with location information that we have for Rivera and Garcia the night of July 18th?
We have a number of events that run into the early morning hours, but what we see is that for the 5:10 to 5:12 a.m. events for Mr. Garcia and the kind of similar time frame for Mr. Rivera, it would appear that those two handsets separate at some point.
And Mr. Rivera's handset, would his events be consistent with his residence?
Yes, again, we see this pattern very frequently with these three particular cell sites that are around his residence, his handset utilizing one or more of those.
And Mr. Garcia's handset, is that consistent with Stephanie Carmona residence?
It would be, yes.
These events you did mention were in the morning hours of the 19th, right? We're moving into July 19th?
Yes, that's
2014?
correct.
Okay, let's talk about July 19th now. What kind of call activity was there that Saturday morning, July 19th?
There was a good bit of call activity for about a 47-minute time frame here.
Okay. And from these records, did it appear that Magbanoa's handset was attempting to contact Garcia's handset via text message and cell phone repeatedly that morning?
Yes, we see events 9:44, 9:44, 9:45, 45, 46, 46, and 46, where those are all outgoing, almost all calls. The 9:45 would be a text, but outgoing from Ms. Magbanoa's handset to Mr. Garcia's handset.
And were any of those communications, as far as the calls, successful? Did they connect?
They did not.
After those unsuccessful attempts to contact Mr. Garcia, who, if anyone, does Ms. Magbanua attempt to contact?
She contacts Anthony Ortiz.
Who, in turn, does Mr. Ortiz contact?
He attempts to contact Mr. Garcia as well.
Now, during the same time frame, is there anybody else who appears, any other handset that appears to be attempting communication with Mr. Garcia?
Yes, Mr. Rivera's handset.
After the call from Ms. Magbanua to Anthony Ortiz, does Anthony Ortiz handset make more than one attempt to reach Garcia's handset?
Yes, it does.
At some point, does Anthony Ortiz's handset attempt to reach Luis Rivera?
It does, yes.
And were all the attempts to reach Mr. Garcia by Mr. Ortiz unsuccessful prior to that reaching out to Mr. Rivera?
They were unsuccessful as well, yes.
During this time, did Mr. Garcia or Mr. Rivera also receive calls from the hybrid rental company?
Yes, they did.
At what time?
We see the first here at 10:08 and 10:09 a.m., and then another at 10:10.
At some point, so all the way up until, so from 9:44 a.m. until, sorry. One second. Sorry, I need to write this down. So from 9:44 until 10:22, does it appear any of these attempts at Garcia have been successful?
No.
At 10:22, what do the records indicate?
That Ms. Magbanua contacted Mr. Rivera.
How many times?
Well, there's the call at 10:22. She again attempts to contact Mr. Garcia at 10:23, and another outgoing call at 10:23 to Mr. Rivera, and the last at 10:31.
Prior to this call at 10:22 a.m., bless you, 10:22 a.m. from Catherine Magbanua to Luis Rivera, and any of the records that you had you ever seen Ms. Magbanua contact Luis Rivera prior to that 10:22 a.m. call?
I have not.
Is there any, once in the call between Ms. Magbanua and Mr. Rivera around the 10:23 timeframe, does that appear to connect and a conversation is had?
The 10:23 call is a minute and 25 seconds in duration. I believe that call did connect, yes.
And after that connected call between Magbanua's headset and Luis Rivera's handset, does Ms. Magbanua's handset ever make any more attempts to contact Sigfredo Garcia?
It does not.
I want to break down some of the location information for these particular set of events. Starting with the time frame 9:44 to 10:02. What can you tell me about the location of the parties involved in this kind of exchange of phone calls that Saturday morning?
So again, breaking down chunks of that call activity, we see these events 9:44 through 10:02. The multiple calls between Ms. Magbanua and Mr. Garcia, or attempted calls, and the other parties. And for Ms. Magbanua's handset, indicated here in red, we can see that her first event is at 9:44 here, and continues communicating with cell sites indicating travel south. And the last event in our time frame here is 10:02, is back again closer to the area of Mr. Rivera's residence. We see his locations in blue, again consistent with the area of his residence.
Now, can you demonstrate in this visual where Charles Adelson's residence is relative to those locations?
Yes, his residence is here.
That's the Whale Harbor location?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, now if you could zoom back out again. So the first event that we have for Ms. Bagbanua this Saturday morning, July 19th, at 9:44 a.m., the dot at the very top there.
That's correct.
So we had no location information from 9:44 a.m. back through that last 10:20 phone call at the Rivera location to Charles Adelson.
That's correct.
You mentioned, or we've seen the slide where there's attempted communications from Magbanua's handset to Garcia throughout that time period, 9:44 to 10:02. Do we know what's going on with Secreto Garcia's cell records at that time?
We see the event that we looked at for location, the 5:12 a.m. event that had cell site location for Mr. Garcia's handset that showed some separation between him and Mr. Rivera. That was the last event that actually connected in his records. And so for the entire time frame that account was active, there were no other events that ever reached that handset or no events coming from the handset. And again, those ran through the records. The account finally terminated in August.
What are possible reasons for no events after that 5 a.m. event the morning of the 19th?
Once again, objection to speculation.
There are a number of reasons that the handset would stop being used. It was physically damaged. The person using it was nowhere near the network and unable to connect. The account became delinquent, or it was powered down.
Would it also be consistent with no longer using a phone?
Yes, it is definitely no longer using the phone.
Next, if we could go to the next series of events for Saturday, July 19th, from 10:04 where we left off in the morning until 10:23 a.m.
Yes, and again, the series of phone calls that we have back and forth between our involved parties here, and we look at the locations for those, and it would appear that Mr. Rivera's handset has moved away from the area of his residence and something more consistent with east.
And Mr. Rivera is in blue.
He is, yes.
So walk me through the beginning when it appears to leave the area of his residence.
Well, we have events just after 10 that communicate with two cell sites here on opposite sides of the water. The 10:09 event and 10:23 as well. But it would be consistent with looking at the times and the cell sites that handset moved away from his residence and somewhere to the vicinity of Ms. Carmona's residence.
And then where does it go?
Then the next events that we have, 10:23, is again contact or attempted contact between Ms. Bagbanua and Mr. Rivera. And looking at his handset for those events, we see the 10:23, 10:35. That will be consistent with travel sort of back towards the area of his residence.
After this tower, can you come zoom back out a little bit? So Rivera's handset near his residence goes near Stephanie Carmona's residence and then returns back to his residence.
Correct.
Approximately what time does his handset appear to be communicating with the towers at Stephanie Carmona's house?
Around the 10:23 timeframe.
And remind me, when was the last time any of these parties attempted to contact Sigfredo Garcia?
10:23.
From 10:23 to 10:31 a.m., are all of those events between Catherine Magbanua's handset and Luis Rivera's handset?
These three, there's an additional number that attempts to contact Mr. Rivera, but the two events, 10:23 and 10:31, are between Ms. Magbanua and Mr. Rivera.
And her location for those two events is consistent with the Rivera residence.
Objection leading.
State your question again, please.
are those two events consistent with the Rivera residence, the 1023?
I'll overrule it.
It's the 1031 event, the last event, is communicating with the same cell site and sector that we saw the previous evening, and just looking at the relationship between Mr. Rivera's residence, the area around his residence, and where that cell site is, then I would say yes, that handset could be consistent with his residence.
Do we have any events with location information for Catherine Magbanwa's handset from 11:32 until 11:22, or approximately 50 minutes?
It's the 1031 event, which ends at 1032, and it both begins and ends on that same cell site and sector we looked at. And there's no other events on her handset with any location information until 11:23.
And are there any events between Magbanwa's handset and Rivera's handset for that same 50-minute period?
There are not.
Do you have any phone evidence which would tell you whether Sigfredo Garcia was in an area consistent with Rivera's location during that same time?
Again, as his handset was not being utilized, there are no events with location, so we can make no determinations.
What is the next event with location information that we have for Catherine Magbanwa?
It's the 1123 event, and we can see that she's now communicating with a cell site and sector that is one south of the one she was previously using.
Is there any other GPS location information for the Prius since the last time we talked about it?
We do have location information for the Prius, both for, I believe, July 20th and July 21st.
And where is the Prius located based on the GPS on July 20th, 2014?
The Prius GPS is indicated by the green here, and it would appear to be in a street about a block and a half away from Ms. Carmona and Mr. Garcia's residence.
And the second ping on July 21, 2014 is at approximately the same location near Ms. Carmona's residence?
That's correct.
Do you recall what date that vehicle was due back based on the rental agreement?
Well before this, as I recall the exact date, but yes.
Fair enough. Now, you mentioned that Mr. Garcia's handset was no longer active after that last event on Saturday, July 19th at 5 a.m. What about Luis Rivera's handset?
His handset continued to have events through July 24th, and July 24th, and this is UTC time here, this 21:57, 9:57 would subtract 4 hours from that, but that's the last event, or one of the very last events in his records, and this handset is, again, not used after this point.
What was that time again?
I'm sorry, it was 9:57 in UTC, which would make it
Be what?
5:57, sorry.
AM?
PM, sir, sorry.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Matt?
I'm showing you what I've marked for identification of States Exhibit 97.
Yes.
Is that a summary of the call activity that we just went through between the parties the morning of Saturday, July 19th, 2014?
Yes, it is.
Objection cumulative, I believe that that same document is contained in the other items that the state has already entered in.
Let me see the document. I'll overrule the objection.
And now I'm showing you States Exhibit 180. Is this an excerpt from the call records that are in evidence in this case, limiting that data for those phone calls to those between Catherine Magbanwa and Sigfredo Garcia on the June 2014 trip?
Yes, it is.
What number did you say?
180, 80?
I thought 180 was the conversation with him this morning.
You're right.
What's that?
You're correct. You're correct.
June call or 181?
181 and 182? It's okay. I apologize, Your Honor.
181,
Yes, sir. So 181 is the excerpt of the June calls, June 2014, just between Catherine McBanwell and Sigfredo Garcia.
Yes.
And now I'm showing you State's Exhibit 182. Is that an accurate excerpt from those voluminous phone records showing just the calls between Catherine McBanwell and Sigfredo Garcia for the July 2014 trip?
Yes, they are.
Your Honor, at this time I'd offer them in evidence as State's Exhibit 181 and 182.
objection.
Without objection from Mr. Garcia.
Same objection that I had before, cumulative.
I'll admit 181, 182.
You had mentioned earlier, in part of your testimony about location information, having reviewed Charlie Adelson's iCloud.
That's correct,
Is that
yes.
right? And that was pursuant to a search warrant to Apple for the contents of his iCloud.
Yes, it was.
Briefly, can you explain what type of information is contained in those iCloud contents?
Objection, Judge.
Overruled. Just a generic explanation.
Certainly, there are communication records in there, text messages, iMessage, direct messaging content, location information, call logs, pictures, contacts, pretty much anything that's in your phone can be stored in the backup.
Can be stored in the what?
In the cloud, it's a backup of your phone.
And is the cloud in the cloud?
The cloud is someone else's computer, but yes, the cloud is a remote computing service. There are all kinds of clouds out there, Google Drive. The iCloud is just one type and allows users of the iOS devices to back up their content or store content in another location for retrieval, synchronization, or safekeeping.
So you've reviewed that in addition to all of the CDs I showed you earlier with the phone records for everyone in this case?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any evidence or proof of communication in anything that you've reviewed whatsoever between the Adelsons and Luis Rivera?
No.
Based on that same data, is there any evidence or proof of communication whatsoever between the Adelsons and Sigfredo Garcia?
Just the one phone call, attempted phone call to Mr. Adelson, Harvey Adelson, is the only contact.
That was the July 1, 2014
That's correct.
call?
Yes.
Same question. Any evidence or proof of communication between Charlie Adelson and Sigfredo Garcia?
No.
Any evidence or proof of Charlie Adelson and Luis Rivera communicating?
No.
Based on the location information for Harvey Adelson, was his handset in Tallahassee on the date of the murder?
It was not.
What about Donna Adelson's handset? Was it in Tallahassee on the date Mr. Markel was murdered?
It was not.
And Charlie Adelson's handset, was it in Tallahassee on the date that Mr. Markel was murdered?
It was not.
I have 1 moment, Your Honor.
Okay.
Thank you, Sergeant Corbitt. I have no further questions.
Why don't we take 10 minutes? Either side, anything.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, we'll stay in session. Ready to be seated? Mr. Cobb.
The discovery issue, Your Honor?
What?
The discovery issue? The discovery issue?
All right, well, it was wait for Ms. Kappelman to tell me that she'd completed her research.
I'm ready, Judge.
Okay?
So the exhibit was provided to the state, looks like it was certified on 9/10 of 19. It was not properly discovered, but it was specifically listed in the state's notice of intent to introduce business records 6 days later. 9/16/19, paragraph 39, DHSMB records regarding traffic tickets received by Luis Rivera on 7/16/14 and Sigfredo Garcia on 6/2/14.
So, what? Why was it not discovered,
I can't.
put in discovery when you got it September 10th?
Well, I wasn't ready to file the notice of business record. I listed it in my system as discovery, but I can't prove where it was ever sent, so I can't tell you the answer.
And
to
you
that.
had mentioned some highway safety records.
Yes, but I can't prove where any of that, I can't show you an email where it was sent to them. So the only thing I
Can't what?
can
I'm
prove
sorry.
for sure was sent was the notice of intent to introduce business records.
Okay. Mr. DeCosta?
Your Honor, it's no coincidence that this discovery issue is happening hand in hand with us not getting the exhibit from Ms. Norris. This is the second time that we've had this problem with this witness. I move for sanctions. It is clear that they were hiding this, not sharing it with us. I don't for a second believe that they just at the last minute threw this together. They had this in advance. They knew that Sergeant Corbitt was taking the stand. They knew that it contained a piece of evidence that Ms. Kaplan has admittedly said was not provided to the Magbanwa defense team. It's not
Until
just
September 16th.
No, it was never, I believe that what you'll say is the item was never provided to us, neither the DHS&B records for Secreto Garcia or the citation. Ms. Kappelman knows the level of investigation we have done on everything, and to quote her, no stone unturned. And that is how we've handled our work on this case as well, too. There's investigation that we would have done on this, that we would have needed to have done on this. That's all.
What is that? What is the investigation you would do as to the traffic ticket?
I'm just getting it right now, and I'm looking at it, meeting with witnesses. To give Your Honor an example of the citation that was given to Louis Rivera, the deposition of Sergeant Downing, finding out exactly what car was done. It wasn't just a matter of looking at the citation and taking its word for it. Speaking to potential witnesses, the location that it happened at, the time that it happened at, the officer that pulled him over, whether there was other occupants inside of the vehicle, if there were depositions of the other occupants inside of the vehicle, the officer that gave the citation. I can just say random things right now, but there would have absolutely been investigation. Your Honor, this is a case where we have flown all over the country deposing witnesses, spent hours and hours on the most simplest of details to make sure that this defendant gets a proper defense. Again, it is no coincidence that this happened hand in hand with us just getting this exhibit, this, well, not demonstrative, but an exhibit that Ms. Norris is using.
Yeah.
Garcia.
Can I make one more comment, Your Honor?
No, I'll let you have.
Yes.
Garcia.
I'll join in and saying that I didn't receive a specific discovery amendment. I did receive documentation today. And I think it's a little bit more material to my defense, but I still think it's something that I should be put on notice on. The Detective Downing's, I apologize, Trooper Downing, that citation was given a long time ago. I was with Mr. DeCoste when he took Trooper Downing's deposition because there was a specific area we wanted to explore. This is something that I would definitely be part of a deposition of because there's certain material issues that we would have. So I joined in the objection.
What did you want to say, Ms. Kaplan?
Just that I invited the defense to view the evidence in my office on 9/18. The state's exhibit 122 was marked and available for viewing at that time. It was marked and available for viewing when Your Honor invited the defense to come view it on the first day that we met here, and then I think you reiterated that last night, and we did stay behind last night after Your Honor left the bench for the defense to review the evidence again. Now, I'm not saying that this was done properly, I'm just saying there have been a lot of opportunities for this
So
item.
was the ticket and the things they saw last night?
Yeah, state's exhibit 122.
Would y'all sit down, please? Don't be, we're not going to start being rude here.
It was.
Okay, so who looked at the stuff?
Mr. Zanganeh and Mr. DeCoste both stayed behind and looked through. I put the discs, I cleaned off this entire desk. I put the discs, the binder that contained photographs, and the binder that contained documents, any items that had not yet been introduced into evidence, and they looked through all of them.
It includes State Exhibit 122.
Yes, sir.
Let me see the document, please.
lastly, Judge, I did provide the evidence list on the first day of trial, and 122 is listed there.
Your Honor, may I respond?
You may.
I did receive an email from Ms. Kaplan saying that items were available to view in her office. I responded to that with a question saying, what now? Because it wasn't clear what she was saying to us, whether she's doing what prosecutors do, come and take a look at my file so I can avoid any accusations of violations of the discovery rules, or she was showing us exhibits. I never got a response. Yes, Your Honor has seen me for the past 2 weeks, for the past couple of years. I rarely get animated. I am animated right now for a genuine reason, because that ticket was not present in that book yesterday. Your Honor, to add on now having a moment to actually look at the citation, other investigation we would have done, it's obviously an issue for the defense whether Luis Rivera was driving that vehicle alone on that day and that trip. There are several routes along this area that we would have pulled surveillance information, whether it's available or not, understanding time has passed, to pull surveillance to see who it was that was driving the vehicle, specifically from the Florida Department of Transportation, for any tolls that it had taken. Unfortunately, well, I would draw that because we had that for the vehicle and we actually did do that. But as to the route that it was taking on that day, because of the location of the citation, we could have pulled surveillance for many adjoining businesses. But just to emphasize, it was not present yesterday.
This is June 2nd at 9:48 p.m. What do you think the significance of that is, Ms. Kaplan?
It's the state's theory that this initial rental car was returned in exchange for the Nissan Sonata that ultimately came to Tallahassee for the first trip because of this ticket. I don't think it's that significant. I'm not sure. I mean, it was just of interest that Mr. Garcia got that rental car, and Mr. Garcia got a ticket in it. He got the ticket in Miami, so I don't know.
Which vehicle is this? This is,
So,
says a silver Nissan. And there's a tag number, CKV I-85. That's the first car that was rented. This is one where the rentals were changed after a couple days. Is that the first?
That vehicle on the second. We would argue with the intent to come to Tallahassee in it. Never did because he got a ticket in it. Exchanged that for the Hyundai Sonata, which came to Tallahassee on the first trip. Does that make sense?
And this is the one that Rivera's record name shows on the rental, or is this the one Garcia's name shows on the rental?
Garcia's name shows on the rental for both that vehicle and the one that he exchanged it for, which came to Tallahassee.
I frankly don't see the great significance of it. I'm not going to admit it at this point in time. We've got a couple other 2 days of trial. If y'all decide it needs to be, that it's overly real significant, then need to give the defense some opportunity to review it and figure out what the significance of it is. We're just not going to get into it at this point in time.
Yes, sir.
What else we need to resolve?
Your Honor, can I make as a court exhibit the demonstratives as court exhibit C and D that I presented on Sergeant Corbitt's directives now?
Okay, and those are not to go to the jury?
Correct.
All right.
Same objection, Your Honor. We have not had proper time to digest these items.
It'd just be them being made part of the record, so I would assume you want them to be part of the record. You don't want them to be part of the record.
Wiser attorneys at the table are telling me I do, so I'll withdraw.
Right. I mean, this is not to go to the jury. This is to make a record, so there would be a record of what was shown, less the portion relating to the ticket was not shown in there.
And I took that part out so it would accurately reflect what was shown to the jury.
Okay. All right. Anything else?
Yes, sir.
All right. Take about 5 minutes.